Vos Excellences, Messieurs, Mesdames, rebonjour. Rebonjour à tous, c'est le moment tant attendu. Merci, Paul. Alors, rebonjour à tout le monde et bienvenue, bien sûr, à nos collègues qui se joignent virtuellement de partout au Canada pour le déjeuner des écrivains d'Ambcanada. Nous sommes heureux d'associer nos collègues du Forum diplomatique et de l'Association professionnelle des agents du service extérieur à cet événement annuel de marque et remercions aussi Books on Beechwood d'installer une table pour l'exposition et la vente des livres que nous vous invitons bien sûr à visiter, ce que plusieurs d'entre vous ont déjà fait. Before I start and I turn to Ian Ferguson, I'd like to welcome two new members to the association, one of whom is with us today, Deirdre Kent. Welcome, Deirdre. Her last posting was ambassador to Norway. And Benoît Lafontaine, qui devrait en principe nous joindre de façon virtuelle. For today, we will not apply the usual rule of Chatham House because we want to promote as much of the writings of our writers as widely as possible. And this said, the recording of the session will be available on the web. Et ça fait plaisir de voir que plusieurs auteurs qui ont précédemment présenté à cet événement ou qui, de toute façon, ont écrit, sont ici parce que c'est l'objectif de ce forum. C'est de souligner la contribution des gens de notre métier et d'encourager ceux qui le veulent et qui le peuvent à faire de même. Et Ian Ferguson m'a obligée, je ne voulais pas le faire, mais m'a obligée de dire, et c'est vrai, qu'en février 2023, quand j'étais dans cette salle et que j'ai entendu les écrivains, c'est là que je me suis dit, c'est assez, you're going to go ahead and you're going to finish your book. So it did serve as an inspiration. Et sans plus tarder, j'invite maintenant Ian Ferguson au podium en disant, lui qui a travaillé sans relâche, avec la rigueur qu'on lui connaît, et l'amabilité que nous lui connaissons aussi, à vous présenter toute cette rencontre. Merci.
Thank you, Roxanne, and thank you all for joining us here in person and to the many people online. We have an interesting lineup of books today. All of the books attest to the talent of the Foreign Service writ large. And that was one of the reasons that we decided to open the participation to Foreign Service alumni who were not necessarily members of our organization. We wanted to tap into the talent pool beyond our membership. It's also the first time we're going to have a digital book with no print edition planned. And interestingly enough, 2 days after Remembrance Day, 4 of the 6 books concern war or some theme related to war. In addition to those that Roxanne has thanked, I wanted to mention Alex Bougaliscus, the chair of the program committee, for her help in shaping the plans for today, and Diane Goddard, Canada's program assistant, who helped in myriad ways to bring this event together that involves a myriad of players and complex technology. There will be a Q&A session afterwards. Those online should use the Q&A function. And without further formality, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Brendan Kelly, head of the historical section at Global Affairs Canada. He wrote the introduction to Supervising a Peace That Never Was, Recollections of Canadian Diplomatic Personnel in Indochina, 1954 to 73. And he's kindly agreed to speak on behalf of the three co-editors, Phil Calvert, Helen Lansdowne, and Nick Etheridge. And I apologize to Nick that on the earlier screenshot, you see his name was not there. So welcome, Dr. Kelly.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Ambassadors Canada for having me today. I'd like to begin by stressing, as Mr. Ferguson mentioned, that although I wrote the introduction to Supervising a Peace That Never Was, all the credit for the book really goes to three people, Nick Etheridge, Phil Calvert, and Helen Lansdowne of the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives at the University of Victoria. Nick, Phil, and Helen couldn't be here in person today, but they wanted me to thank the organizing committee for including their book. In the next 7 minutes, what I'd like to do is briefly explain the book's origins, my small role in it, and some of its key themes. So the idea for the book emerged in the autumn of 2021, when one former member of the Canadian Peace Commission in Vietnam, Nick Etheridge, ran into another former member, David Anderson, who would go on to be Environment Minister. This was at a school reunion in Victoria in 2021. And so David Anderson started speaking to Nick about his time in Saigon. And so he regaled him about stories of his experience there, including dating the niece of the US ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, and water skiing on the river. And so, from that moment on, Nick thought, he made it his mission to collect the reminiscences of Canadian diplomatic personnel who served on the peace commissions in the three countries of Indochina, which of course, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And the result is really the essays you see in this digital book from people who really need no introduction to this group. Fred Bild, Alan Sullivan, Leslie James, Manfred von Nostitz, and Gabrielle Lessard, among several others. As co-editor, Nick had a willing partner in Phil Calvert, who again needs no introduction here, given his experience and expertise in Asia. And then thanks to Helen Lansdowne at CAPI at the University of Victoria, the book had an institutional home and key resources. So when Nick, Phil, and Helen approached me for help at the historical section, I was eager to help. Simply put, and I think I'm speaking to the choir on this one, we don't write enough in Canada about our foreign policy history. There are too few professional historians who study the subject. They're supervising too few graduate students, and too few books, theses, articles, you name it, are written on Canada's diplomatic history. And so, needless to say, with a limited grasp of our diplomatic past, it's very hard to chart informed policy in the present. So I wanted to help. As a result of what I said as well, books like this, where they capture the recollections, the memories, what went into a posting of people who were there, who served in kind of dramatic situations, dramatic events, who witnessed history, are so valuable. Because when historians aren't in sufficient number, retired diplomats can help fill the void with many of their books, their memoirs, their diaries. And of course, in Canada, we have a rich tradition of diplomatic memoir, and especially diplomatic diaries, people like Alan Gottlieb, Charles Ritchie, and others. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to help. The book also aligns with the current work of the historical section of Global Affairs Canada. So as some of you may know, our main project, really since 1967, is a series called Documents on Canadian External Relations. And so we've published it for over 50 years, the department has, and it really features the most important diplomatic documents from the department's archives. So memos to the minister, cables from our missions abroad, memos from head of divisions to the deputy minister, et cetera, to DGs. And so it's really a treasure trove of information that's widely used by professors, students, and policymakers. And so as it happened, the stars aligned because our next 2 volumes in the series will be on Canadian diplomacy during the Vietnam War, including Canada's role on the international control commissions there. And so I was already immersed in the research for this with my team. And so it seemed logical that I could help by writing the introduction to the book. As I argue in my intro, our membership on the commission reflected several key themes in Canadian diplomatic history. The first is the perennial importance of Canadian-American relations. Our presence in Vietnam was delicate since the Americans were there, needless to say as well, but militarily. As Tom Delworth, who again is a name I don't think I need to introduce to anybody in this group, but he was our Vietnam desk officer in the 1960s, stressed to me once, the Canadian government sympathized with the US effort in Vietnam to protect South Vietnam from aggression, but the Canadian government at the same time had reservations about US policy, in particular the bombing. In the rebellious 1960s, the concept of quiet diplomacy increasingly seemed to be quiet complicity to many left-wing critics. And so this became an issue, obviously, in Canadian diplomacy. Questions arose about the extent to which Canada should publicly support or condemn the United States. Many of you will be familiar with the famous story of when Lester B. Pearson had the temerity to suggest in Philadelphia in 1965 that the US might consider ceasing bombing Vietnam, or at least pausing it. He was grabbed by the lapels of his shirt by President Lyndon Johnson, who snarled, "You pissed on my rug." Second, another theme is our presence in Indochina took place against the backdrop of the Cold War and its alliance system. So remember, in Indochina, on all 3 commissions in the 3 countries, it was tripartite. So you had Canada representing the liberal democratic West, Poland, the communist bloc, and India, the neutral nations of the Third World, as it was then known. And not surprisingly, again, when you think of the composition of the ICC, Canadian diplomats sympathized with South Vietnam and its plight. There was even some drama, as in 1967, when a reporter for the Montreal Star discovered and rather sensationally wrote about in the newspaper that Canadians were, quote, spying for the Americans during their time in North Vietnam. There were also weapon sales. Canada sold weapons to the United States that ended up in Vietnam. So again, this was more fodder for the critics who said this was quiet complicity and that Canada should be allegedly ashamed of its role in Vietnam. Third, another theme is that service on the ICC highlighted Canada's duty to the international community. So in 1954, Canada was asked by the great powers, the United States, France, the Soviet Union, to supervise the peace in Indochina. It could hardly say no, nor having said yes, could it easily leave. And so even after it became clear that there was no peace to keep. And so as Cy Taylor memorably puts it in the book, the ICC in Vietnam, which lasted from 1954 to 1973, is a testament to how hard it is to kill an international organization. Once you're in, you can't get out. In the case of Vietnam, as I mentioned, Canada was there for almost 20 years, from 1954 to 1973, from the withdrawal of French forces after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu to the withdrawal of American ones 19 years later under President Richard Nixon. And this was one of the longest and most frustrating missions in Canada's diplomatic history. In many ways, it was Afghanistan before Afghanistan. By the 1960s, 1 out of every 3 Canadian Foreign Service officers had served in Indochina, which is just a remarkable proportion by any standard. So that's the high-level diplomatic history that I discuss in my intro. But the other point that I make there is that the strength of this book is really not just the diplomatic history that it offers. Its 13 essays speak to what might be called the social history of Canada's involvement in Indochina. What I mean by that is the lived experiences of people such as yourselves, Canadian diplomatic personnel, men and women who were posted there. And so here too, there are several recurring themes in the book, and I'll just highlight 3. One is comradeship. Again, this is nothing new to a group like this. Those who served in Indochina forged bonds and made friendships that lasted a lifetime. So this book testifies to that fact, and that someone like Nick Etheridge, who served on the ICC in 1972 and 1973, could draw on his network and circle of friends and find people to contribute to the book who served on the commission in the 1950s, such as Cy Taylor, in the 1960s, such as David Anderson, and in the 1970s, such as Les James. Another recurring theme is the concept of service in the words foreign service, a point current GAC Deputy Minister David Morrison likes to make. Indochina, of course, was a hardship posting. You had the sheer distance from Canada. You had the tropical heat, and you had an environment in a region that had been at war for over 3 decades. Many of the Canadian diplomats assigned to these ICC, I think it would be fair to say, would have preferred to be posted anywhere else. But they accepted their assignment without complaint, and they tried to fulfill a thankless and really impossible task. In short, they did their duty, however frustrating, however challenging, however impossible. Finally, the last theme is that challenging as it was, posting to the peace commissions, and I think this might be the most important theme of the book, really gave an entire generation of Canadian diplomats direct experience of the Indo-Pacific region. That region will be one of, if not the most important in the world over the next century. It's thus crucial that Canadians better understand our diplomatic engagement with that part of the world. Thanks to Supervising a Peace that never was, its editors, Nick, Phil, and Helen, and all those who contributed essays to the book, Canadians will be able to do just that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. Our next speaker will be joining us from Lindsay, Ontario, in the Kawartha Lakes region. So please welcome Rhonda Gossen, who will speak about her recent book, The 12th of February, Canadian Aid for Gender Equality During the Rise of Violent Extremism in Pakistan.
Hello, everyone. It seems my video is not coming on. I don't know if the technical people can do it. It says I can't start the video because the host has stopped it. Should I go ahead?
Wait a minute, please.
Okay.
Right.
It's not working. Is there somebody live that can go first and I can go later?
We can hear you.
Okay. Should I proceed?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's a little odd not having a picture, but anyway, thank you so much for hosting me today to be part of this writer's luncheon. It's such a great idea, and I hope this will lead to more books by Canadian ambassadors and staff of Global Affairs Canada. You know, as a previous speaker, Brendan mentioned, there's a dearth of books written by Canadian ambassadors and staff, and it'd be wonderful to see more. I myself worked in Pakistan 3 times over my career with CEDA. It was during my last time posted there from 2010 to 2014 that I'd heard so much about the lost legacy of Canada's support to the women's rights and gender equality movement in that country, as well as support to the human rights civil society. CEDA, who I'm still calling, I think it's former CEDA, but I'm still calling it CEDA. CEDA's previous partners were telling me that CEDA had been a forward-looking aid donor that had supported their pro-people and pro-women agenda, and that it was a story that needed to be told and not relegated to obscurity, as is often the case, particularly with aid work successes and innovations. In an era of digital files especially, it's really easy to lose some of this knowledge. So I felt there were historical lessons there, particularly ones on strengthening civil society as a pillar of democracy. So when the Feminist International Assistance Policy was announced in 2017, with the objective of funding grassroots women's organizations and women's rights movements, I couldn't help think back to how CEDA was doing just that in the 1980s and 1990s, and parallel to the women's rights movement for gender justice. But I'll come back to that in just a moment. It was also evident by 2010 that there was a serious regression in women's rights happening as a result of the security environment and the growing internal militancy, fueled mainly by the wars in Afghanistan. This became apparent the first time we ventured out to visit CEDA-funded projects, the Women's Economic Empowerment Projects in Punjab, under armed escort, in armored vehicles, and after obtaining a non-objection certificate from the Ministry of Interior. I was also reading daily about increased violence against women. Just going to see if that video works. No. But also about new women's protection legislation that was coming into place. But I began to ask myself whether gender issues were impacted by violent extremism, and if so, how. Since that time, research has really flourished on this topic and produced evidence of the correlation between the rise of gender-based violence and increased incidents of violent extremism, which is a major theme of this book. We now know that gender issues are deeply entwined with extremism and militancy, as we're seeing so vividly today in Afghanistan and even in Iran. My book talks about the research by Professor Jackie True from Australia, published by UNDP and UN Women, that demonstrated this correlation between gender-based violence and terrorism, such that the former can serve as a predictive indicator for the latter. It's clear that a relationship exists, although the causality is not fully understood. But their recommendations are for governments and others to monitor and track gender-based violence, particularly in conflict-affected areas, in efforts to prevent violence that can lead to political violence and eventually violent extremism. The issue could not really be more timely and urgent given the misogynistic Taliban's regime in Afghanistan and the impact it's had on Pakistan, especially in terms of emboldening the Pakistani Taliban, which has similar ideological views, including those about women, to the Taliban in Afghanistan. But it was the Pakistan women's rights movement, the Women's Action Forum, that first raised the alarm bells on the impact of policies and laws of the dictator Zia al-Haq that were severely discriminatory to women and girls. It was their protests on February 12, 1983, against the discriminatory laws that saw women arrested, beaten, thrown in jail. That day, and the title of this book, is now recognized as Pakistan National Women's Day in honor of those brave women. This group aligned itself with the movement for democracy to also strengthen their voices. It continues to fight the opposing forces of women's rights on all levels, but never accepted funding, including from CEDA. But Canada indirectly supported these efforts. Through a series of women's funds, starting in the late 80s, Canada funded local women's organizations directly with small grants for both institutional and project support. From grassroots to policy-level groups, CEDA helped sustain their work and momentum, and this built the capacity of a gender equality movement. Canada was the first aid agency to start a major program of support to women's development in 1984. There were 5 women's funds over 20 years. For Pakistan, not a lot of money, but very strategic in their direct support to the Pakistan women's organizations and their agendas. The third fund, for about $6 million, was approved in 1996, the year that Taliban first took power in Afghanistan. CEDA also funded Canadian organizations that were funding grassroots women's organizations, such as the Aga Khan Foundation, through its innovative and successful rural support program in northern Pakistan, which started in 1983 and of which Canada was the first supporter. It was an experiment, and it continued going and evolved into now what is a very strong entrepreneurship type programming involving both youth, women, and girls. But by 2007, Canada had stopped all of these funds, and by 2009, all the funding had halted to local women's organizations and to human rights NGOs. So just as the Pakistan Taliban established itself and were gaining ground, and at the height of Canada's engagement in Afghanistan, aid to Pakistan was dramatically decreased. It was quite a shock to both sides, and I felt a major impact on our diplomatic engagement, as gender equality had been a major focus of the aid program. And the organizations we partnered with really had their eyes and ears on the ground. They were connected at all levels across the country and had provided us insights and knowledge on what was really going on. But by then, these organizations had the capacity to organize and coalesce to obtain significant funding from the Americans. So using the same model Canada had created, they received a massive grant from USAID. And CEDA's human rights partners, NGOs, went to the UK aid for sizable funding. So Canada had really passed its leadership role to the UK and the US. a loss for us, but the work was sustained. This is one of the historical lessons of the book, that helping to build the capacity of a civil society-based gender equality movement was critical to democracy, stability, and to rights and equality for all. Canada strengthened this civil society organizations at a time when they were prioritizing poverty reduction, human rights, inclusion. So to me, it begs the question of what are the implications for this kind of assistance going forward, especially following the US election and a possible change in government in Canada. Will we continue to support through the aid program ways to strengthen and protect democracies around the world? If, as the international affairs expert Valerie Hudson and her colleagues have found, nearly every dimension of national security is intertwined with whether women are subordinated or empowered within their society, then the level of gender equality in a country such as Pakistan will be an important factor in policies to stabilize the economy as well as internal security. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you. Sorry you couldn't see me.
Thank you. Thank you, Rhonda. We did have a picture of you at least. Our next speaker will be our former colleague, Alan Bowker, who will talk about A Church at War, MacKay Presbyterian United Church, New Edinburgh, and the First World War. And I think he's speaking to us from New Edinburgh, if I'm not wrong.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I guess you can't see me, but I hope you can hear me. And I want to echo what others have said in commending Ambcanada for this wonderful initiative of a writer's lunch. I'll launch right in. On the walls of MacKay United Church in New Edinburgh are plaques containing the names of 140 men and one woman from what was then MacKay Presbyterian Church, who served in the First World War, and the 19 who fell. My book explores who these people were, what impelled them to fight in a far-off war, what they experienced on the battlefields of Europe, and what impact the war had on their families, their church, and their community. How did I come to write this book? It certainly was not something I ever intended to do. At the annual Remembrance Sunday service at MacKay United Church in November 2014, the names of the men who had fallen in the First and Second World Wars were solemnly read out, as they have been every year. Tim Cook, Canada's leading military historian, who is a member of the congregation, pointed out to me that with the service records of the soldiers from the First World War then coming online, it would be possible in future years to tell the stories of these men as real people who lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and not merely as century-old names on a wall. So each Remembrance Sunday service, beginning in 2015, I told the stories of the men who had fallen a century earlier. As I got deeper into the subject and employed an ever-widening array of sources, my focus widened to include all those who had served and their families, church and community. What had begun as a memorial to the fallen had now become a full-scale study of a church at war. But the 19 fallen remained central to this book. Some died in desperate battles or dogfights in the air or artillery duels. 2 won the military medal and 1 the military cross. Others died with tragic randomness, victims of artillery or sniper fire, lost forever in the mud and carnage on the last day of the Battle of the Somme, or from disease. For their families who had supported their service, watched and waited, hoped and prayed, pride was mingled with profound sorrow. 6 left widows to cope as best they could, and children who would grow up without their fathers. There are also the stories of those who served and came back. 2/3 of the soldiers from MacKay were Canadian, born with deep roots in the local community. Several sets of brothers served, as many as 4 brothers in one case, as well as fathers and sons. Their families endured increasing hardship as they coped with war, sickness, and grief. And when they came back from the war, they had to readjust with the help of their families and their church to civilian life. Every historian tries to be objective, but no writer can avoid some personal engagement with his subject. For me, writing this book became a profoundly moving experience. My wife and I visited the Commonwealth cemeteries in Belgium and France where the MacKay fallen are buried. Places of beauty, peace, and profound reflection, which convey powerful messages about service and sacrifice, sorrow and loss. We also visited memorials containing the names of MacKay men who have no known graves. One MacKay soldier is one of 55,000 names on the walls of the Menin Gate in Ypres, of British Empire soldiers who fell in this sector alone during just the first 3 years of war and have no known graves. Each evening since 1929, the citizens of Ypres have held a last post ceremony to honor them. At one such ceremony in October 2015, I was privileged to read the exhortation. A few days later at the Vimy Memorial, where 2 MacKay men are named, we met people who said that for the first time in their lives, they understood what it meant to be a Canadian. But why include these places in an academic study of a church at war? Because most of the families of those fallen soldiers could not afford to travel to Europe, to visit the last resting place of their son, brother, father, husband, to lay flowers, to say a prayer. They had, in effect, lost them twice. Describing these corners of foreign fields that are forever MacKay is essential to completing the stories of the fallen and telling the story of a church at war. The research challenges of writing this book were many. People usually write about a historical topic because there's a body of evidence available. But when your starting point is a particular church whose people did not leave a rich record of their lives, things get more challenging. Church documents recorded the names of the congregants and the activities of the church, but said little about theology or what people thought or felt. The story of a church at war had to be built, layer by layer, from the stories of hundreds of people, using information from local archives, city directories, and descendants, but mostly from sources that have recently become available online. Service files of all the soldiers who fought for the Canadian forces in the First World War, as well as circumstances of death registers, war diaries, citation records, and other information, have been put online by Library and Archives Canada. Ancestry.ca provides a portal to a cornucopia of birth, marriage, and death records, immigration records, and ships registers, census information, and electoral registers, not only from Canada, but from Britain and the United States. Newspapers.com provided access to 80 years of the 2 Ottawa dailies, and Beechwood Cemetery registers have information on the hundreds of people buried there. There was no plan. The thing just growed as I spent more and more time down the rabbit hole, assembling details about people, places, and events into individual stories that coalesced into the story of a church at war. The resulting book is unique and may, I hope, prove a useful model for genealogists, for public historians writing the history of churches, companies, schools, and communities, or for military and social historians exploring in depth the meaning and impact of war on ordinary people. For this reason, it was important to have this book published by an academic press. This was not easy, as it does not fit easily into conventional academic categories. But after 2 years of searching, I am grateful that the Ottawa University Press and the Mercury series of the Canadian Museum of History saw its value and agreed to take it on. They have been excellent to work with. I think they've produced a wonderful product, and they have supported this project and me at every turn. But in closing, I want to highlight what I hope is the primary value of this book. To be a historian is to enter what one writer called the foreign country of the past, to put aside present-day preconceptions, to see the world through their eyes, to walk with the people, above all, to tell the story in a readable, compelling way, using evidence and imagination to bring the people of the past convincingly to life for the people of the present. For that, in the end, is what all history, Macro or micro, academic or popular, should be about stories of people and of the great ideas and events that shaped their lives and created our world. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for your very moving summary. I think it illustrates how much a labor of love these publications are and how many years that the authors can put into seeing their project through to completion. Our next speaker will be Bodil Jensen, who will speak about her forthcoming book titled Denmark's Forgotten Holocaust, My Family History in Letters.
Which shows you there was a miracle that happened in the parkade or the parking lot out here. I walked out of the car without the cane. Anyway, yes, Ian and I went to university together, the University of Alberta. And I wonder if the the Tim Cook that Alan Bowker just mentioned wasn't part of that group. I'm not sure. Anyway, maybe he can get back to us. I actually have a PowerPoint presentation. And to give you an idea of what this book is about, a book that I have labored on since before 2007, we'll just flip through the slides. Can we have the next one? This is the book is about my grandparents on my mother's side. And there is the family at their summer residence in about 1923 in Denmark, just north of Copenhagen. You can see my mother is a short, dark-haired girl standing at the back. Her name is Agnes. She's also an author, Canadian journalist, Danish-Canadian journalist, and author. And I would point out that this is an upper crust Danish family. I've been sitting beside an ambassador from Denmark who tells me I speak like the former Queen of Denmark. So, and that's their accent. Next slide, please. Yes, is this better? Okay. Next slide, please. Here we have all 7 children. Again, you can recognize my mother. She's sitting in the front row, second from, is that your right, your left? Anyway, that side, over there, near the windows. The oldest were twins. And there you have my grandparents, as in Danish, we would say mormor and morfar. You distinguish whether they're father's father or mother's father. Next slide, please. So to show you that this family was with it, here's my mother at the Midsummer Festival in Tisvilde, dressed up as, does anybody recognize her? Josephine Baker. Now she's a teenager, maybe 13. Her 2 brothers are at the side with some sort of tropical plant. Apparently they had more sword fights than actually shielding Josephine Baker. My mother won first prize for her entry, and that was a bag of licorice. The picture is as good as it is because this was the press photo. Now, what kind of parents would allow their 13, 14-year-old to go to review of Josephine Baker? Well, you know, these things happen in Denmark. But her parents did not take her. Some close friends did. So we move quickly on to the Second World War. And Denmark was occupied in 1940
by the Nazi regime. The government continued to, in coordination with the occupiers, to govern until 1943. In October 1943, there was a razzia of the Danish Jews. Now, the Jews in Denmark, for the most part, were an integral part of the Danish society. They were not in a ghetto. They were not separate. When my family, both sides of the family, both my morfar and mormor came to Denmark, they were given rights of like all citizens in Denmark. So there was never any question of integrating them. They were just simply a part of the Danish community. But in October 1943, the razzia, the roundup of the Danish Jews began. And at that time, approximately, well, virtually all, we can say, the Danish Jews were either hidden or transported with the help of many in the Danish community to Sweden. So you can picture my aunts and uncles, my mother with her first husband and 9-month-old baby, making it to Sweden in fishing boats, rowboats, you name it, in the course of the next few weeks after October 1st. However, my grandparents did not go. They stayed home and were picked up by the SS and thereafter transported to Theresienstadt. And that is what the book is mainly about. Next slide, please. So this is the one and only communication we have from my grandmother to her niece in Denmark. I can't find this person on the family tree. However, what she is saying is, if you can read the English, she's basically saying, she has 30 words. That's all they were allowed to write. And it had to be in German. So you can see it's written in pencil. And the translation, I don't read German. So a professional translator, Krista Chappell, did all the cards that we have in German. Basically, what my grandmother is saying is, we are starving, send food. Can you all read that, what's written there? When she's talking about remembering what they had to eat. This is code. They're not allowed, all these letters were censored. And it took about 3 months for them to travel from Theresienstadt, which is just outside Prague, to wherever they were going, in Denmark or Sweden. Next, please. So this is the only card we have that my mother wrote. And it's amazing. When I went through the letters, they're all handwritten. I could recognize the handwriting of my relatives, because over the years, when we immigrated to Denmark when I was 5, and so we had many, many, many letters handwritten that came from them. And so I was able to recognize the handwriting of the different authors. Kel is the 9-month-old who traveled in the fishing boat with my mother and his dad. And basically, my mother is talking about Kel. He has 1 tooth, which, you know, for a 1-year-old, that's pretty good. And he can walk 30 steps. And they knew that the letters were censored, so they couldn't say much, but they could say nice things. So she basically goes through the list of what's happening in the family that might lighten the load of her mother and father. So next letter, please. This is my Aunt Dot, Master Dot. She is a nurse in Sweden, and she actually, it's her cards that primarily survive. And excuse me, gosh, this is almost like a weapon. So again, she's talking about her nursing career, how she hopes that everything is going well. Unbeknownst to her, she's writing this letter in July of 1944. My grandmother died at the end of February 1944, and news of that had not reached them in Sweden at the point where this letter is written. So when I talk about letters, they're postcards, you know, about the size of the regular small postcards we buy today. One side has the address. You can see in the top corner nearest the window, and the other side is blank, and you write whatever you're going to write. If there are things that aren't acceptable to the censors, of course, they're just discarded. Next card, please. Next card, next slide. This is the monument that was erected in 1946 in the Vesta Kirko, the Vesta churchyard for the Jewish part in Denmark, in the heart of Copenhagen. I should give you some statistics here. About 35,000 people died in Theresienstadt. So to describe it as a ghetto is just not true. It was a concentration camp. 88,000 people were transported to death camps from Theresienstadt. 23,000 survived. Of those, one was my grandfather. Now, how did he leave? The Red Cross. I mean, if you're going to support anybody, support the Red Cross. The Red Cross sent buses before the war was over. They were called white buses because they were painted white with either a Swedish or a Danish flag on them. They were like ambulance buses. And they arrived in Theresienstadt, amongst many other of the concentration camps, but they arrived in Theresienstadt in April 1945. And of the approximately 470 Jewish Danes who were in Theresienstadt, 423 got on those buses. My grandmother had died of typhoid and basically starvation, typhoid being the death knell. So 53 or 54 Danes died in Theresienstadt, and their names are on this memorial. I won't read the actual inscription. That's my translation. But the question is, how did the Danes manage to save almost all the prisoners from Denmark? Well, there's several things that went on there. One was the involvement of the Danish Lutheran Church, the monarch, the people in Denmark, and the need for the Germans to keep peace in Denmark because it was a major transit route from Norway where there was H2O2, which my daughter, the chemist, says is not heavy water, but something else that's needed in nuclear bomb development. So they needed a peaceful Denmark. And no Danes, all these transports that started in Theresienstadt, no Danes were allowed to board. It was just a rule. No Danes could volunteer to board because they were advertised as being, being the road to freedom. People didn't really appreciate that they were just being sent, and not in all cases, but in most cases, to the death camps. And this brings me, that's the last of my slides, but this brings me to the point. Why would I write this book? Well, basically because just before my mother's death in 2007, one of my cousins sent me these letters, and there are about 35 of them. Something that I had not known about before. I grew up not knowing a thing about our background, which is very, very easy to hide from me since I grew up in Edmonton, far from any relatives who were going to say anything. Even the Danish community in Edmonton, who knew my parents from Denmark, never said anything about our background. But so I was presented with these letters. And then after my mother died, we went through my parents' papers. And as I said, my mother was a writer. She had saved many of the letters she had written, many of the letters that were sent to her during the Second World War. And it was like they were just waiting for somebody to pick them up and make a book out of it. The most interesting part of the uplifting part, one can say that, of the whole project was to go through the photo albums and identify people. That was very exciting. Are you giving me a 1-minute warning? No. Okay. Anyway, the application to today's history. My family is not that different from many other families who have lived through horrors of war, famine, other things. What's going on in the Middle East today is just, to me, incredible. It's incredible that the international community is allowing the slaughter, the genocide that's taking place in Gaza to take place. Despite my background, I would like to point out that my grandmother was a pacifist. Her uncle won the gold medal for service in Denmark for the work he did in World War I. And he worked on both sides to rescue people. And to me, somebody's forgotten a lesson of history, that we have to live our lives and form our communities so that all people are safe. And the Ukraine is one thing. You have misguided, in my opinion, misguided imperial aspirations. But what's going on in the Middle East is just beyond the pale. So how would you, got 1 minute left. Okay, this is a self-managed book. There are companies here in Canada, Friesen's out in the West Coast, they do English, Bouquin-Bec in Quebec do French books, who will help you set up your book, print your book, provide even the editors. I come from a literary background, so I have all these people at hand except the actual printers and the layout artist who is working diligently on my book right now. But I would encourage all of you to write your family histories or to create the photo record for your descendants to enjoy and to identify all those photos, because it really would hearten them. Thank you.
Thank you, Bodil. Our next speaker will be Tim Martin, who has written about Canada's most recent war, and the title is Unwinnable Peace, Untold Stories of Canada's Mission in Afghanistan. Tim will be from Pistol Lake in northwestern Ontario.
Thanks very much, Ian. Hi, everybody. I was the last ROC in Kandahar. That stands for Representative of Canada in Kandahar. And it was an intense experience. Was a disturbing experience in many ways. And my book is called Unwinnable Peace, Untold Stories of Canada's Mission in Afghanistan. It's based on 25 interviews and my experience to tell the story. When I came back from Afghanistan, I was very angry. I was angry in particular about the relationship of the international mission to the warlords, who were so powerful in controlling the direction of governance in Afghanistan. It was something I wanted to express, and I decided to express that in the form of a novel, a political thriller called Moral Hazards. Moral Hazards was noticed by a publisher, and the publisher, Tidewater Press, told me that they didn't think Canada had an accessible history of our longest war, the war in Afghanistan, and asked me to write it. And we entered into an arrangement to do so. It was hard to write because it was hard to get departmental permission for employees to speak on the record. A lot of the people I worked with are still working in global affairs. But mostly it was hard to write because it's hard to arrive at a reckoning, national and personal, on Canada's longest war. It's a book of stories. It's not a policy or a political analysis, although it's organized in a chronological and thematic way so we can draw policy and political conclusions from it. Here's what Hannah Thibodeau said about my book in her blurb. Tim Martin's groundbreaking work goes beyond the headlines, uncovering the untold stories behind the conflict. With firsthand accounts from diplomats, aid workers, and Afghan interpreters, Martin unravels the intricacies of the mission, offering readers a nuanced understanding of the realities on the ground. His storytelling serves as a testament to the enduring dedication of those who pursued a safe and stable Afghanistan, achieving victories in some battles, yet unable to secure a lasting peace. As I said, it's a book of stories. There's a story of how Rambo got his nom de guerre. Our translators, they had a dangerous job and they were targets. They were considered the eyes and ears of NATO, and so they were an enemy of the Taliban. Rambo was joined by Shorty, Junior, and Elvis, our other translators, and he got his name because he was caught in a firefight, had to pick up a gun, tied his scarf around his head, and looked just like Sylvester Stallone in First Blood. Ben Roswell, probably a lot of you know Ben. I tell the story of how he took on the warlord who ran Kandahar province, Ahmed Wali Karzai, but ended up getting slapped down by the Americans, who told him, we're trying to kill terrorists, and he's very good at killing terrorists. There's Richard Colvin, who I'm sure all of you have heard of, how he first stepped into the prisoner, the detainee issue, the poisonous detainee issue. That was when he was at Camp Nathan Smith in Kandahar, location of our provincial reconstruction team. The guards came to him and said, there's a woman outside. She wants to talk to a Canadian. It was a woman, poor, in distress, said, I need to find my husband. Did your soldiers take him? He called to try and find out, and nobody knew. That's when he learned that nobody knew, nobody was keeping records of the detainees being kept. Terry Hackett came from an Indigenous healing lodge as Correction Canada personnel to the notorious Sarposa prison. We were trying to, and successful, in instituting international standards and really a notorious industrial scale dungeon, or what had been that way. I tell the story of Terry, the work he did, and how he was trapped in a Taliban breakout attempt that started when a suicide dump truck drove into and blasted down the perimeter wall of the prison. There's Mariam, the first, last, and only female Afghan interpreter in Canada. And me, of course. I tell the story of trying to use our classic diplomatic tool of having dinner with someone to build trust. It was the head of the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission, invited him to have a dinner at our provincial reconstruction team. I had permission to allow him in without the usual pat down and search. He was driving up to our gate. I was watching on the security camera. He gets out of his car. He walks past the first barrier, it raises. He steps over the dragon teeth to stop to puncture tires of intruders. And just as he's about to go past the second gate and into a, and we were to second gate and into our base, there was an exchange of rocket-propelled grenades right behind him. The gates closed. He was stuck outside. The camp siren wailed and we snapped into stand 2 mode, sheltering in place while the soldiers tried to figure out if we were under attack. I said I was sorry. He said, it's not your fault. This is Kandahar. Well, here's the pitch for my book, because it's time to buy presents for Christmas and other holidays. I think it's a very good book for your niece who wants to be a general. It's a very good book for your nephew who wants to be an ambassador. And it's a great book for your brother-in-law who thinks ambassadors only sit around and drink cocktails at receptions. It's not very long, 200 pages. And it's a contemporary history of our longest war through the eyes of diplomats and aid workers. And also, maybe most importantly, it helped me come to a reckoning with what's the meaning of our longest war. And I think it'll do that for other readers too. Thanks very much for letting me have a chance to talk to you about my book, and I hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Tim. We have one more speaker. Nick Coughlin was hoping to zoom in from the People's Republic of Salt Spring Islands, but had some difficulty signing in online. We have a technological workaround. He's going to be speaking through Doug's phone into the microphone. So we've gone over time, but I think the stories are so compelling that we should carry through with our program.
Can you hear me? All right, you're on.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for what I hope was a kind introduction. And thank you to
Bill, everyone's okay? Sorry, we're just checking sound levels. Is it okay? Yeah, Bill, can you turn up number 2 a little bit? My assistant. Okay, give it a shot now.
All right, well, thanks again for what I hope was a kind introduction there. And thanks to all of those who helped set up this event. I do wish to assure you that for the occasion I am wearing a jacket and tie. You'll have to take my word for that. And perhaps you can visualize me. I'm sitting at my dining room table looking over to Comedy Channel in the Gulf Islands. So I can't come with you face to face today, but I'm guessing the thinking obviously are old enough to remember the era of telegrams of global affairs. As people from the morning script that would open with a selection of the most interesting reports received overnight at headquarters from meetings abroad. First thing I do every morning is see if I've made the top 10. So I feel like I've made the list again, the top 15, with this opportunity to tell you a little bit about my recent book. The title, Sailing to the Heart of Japan, indicates it's about both sailing and Japan, topics you may not be intimately familiar with. But at another level, I hope it may strike a chord. It's about a foreigner in a strange land trying to make sense of the place by asking a lot of sometimes blunt questions on sometimes sensitive topics, trusting they'll be forgiven, which is what diplomats often do. I should say, by the way, that foreigners on sailboats are a lot rarer even than foreign diplomats in Japan. Maybe 12 yachts and things from overseas. So their crew are given a lot of leeway, not just as outsiders, but as people who have made an unusual effort to go out of their way. The route that my wife Jenny and I took as we sailed to Japan from New Zealand was through the World War II battlefields of the Western Pacific, including Guadalcanal, the location of the first decisive American victory in the war. So what did our new friends have to say about what you might think was this controversial topic? Japan's role in the war. One laughed and said, in history class, we would reach about 1930 at the end of the school year. We start the next year at August 1945. I've never heard of this place, Guadalcanal. Another commented with a shrug, I remember that in 1975, our emperor, Hirohito, visited London and was received by the Queen. Was there anything wrong in the war? It certainly didn't look like it to us. We lost and we got on with it. Not everyone was so blasé. Nori was an elderly sailor we met in Fukuoka. He was born in 1941 and could remember the American B-29 coming over in the last year of the war. His older brother ran away from home in 1945 at the age of 16 to volunteer as a kamikaze pilot. Nori later found out that he was one of a flight of 6 that took off from Kyushu to target US battleships off Okinawa. 3 never made it to the target, the others were shot down. Nori was very bitter, but not as the Americans. He said to us, you know, harakiri, suicide, was never meant for ordinary people like us. It was for upper-class samurai. I'll never forgive the Japanese generals who killed my brother. Some of our encounters with Japan's fabled bureaucracy were kept dead. In Japan, for historic reasons that date back 400 years, all ports and harbours are deemed to be open or closed. But the harbour in literally every bay, most of them is closed. Some of them, because you need a permit for every one. So, using the remote stoppers inshore archipelago in this kind of sea, we received the news of a typhoon headed our way. We spent a full hour consulting with friendly Coast Guard officials over the best place to seek refuge with our boat. Then, when we thought everything was settled and agreed, there was an indrawn breath from our new friend. Mundai, he said, which means problem. The magical day we agreed upon was not on our permit, which is pointed so likely. We would have to sail 100 miles back to Nagasaki, seek a revised permit, then return. By which time, of course, the typhoon would be long past. We nodded persistently. We knew there was no point in arguing. A week later, we jumped into the same people. We knew we ignored his instructions, but we both behaved as if it was the first time we met. Next time we applied for cruising permit and looked at every possible stop we might make, however unlikely, it ran into the hundreds. Another topic involving, if I may, also in Gossen, we found ourselves one day morning at the quiet bay with what looked like a pair of schools, junior and middle perhaps, at its head. Monday morning came. Sure enough, we watched the teachers arrive in their cars, but there was no sign of any children. Mid-morning, a teacher leading a 7-year-old boy by the hand knocked on our hull and very politely asked in faltering English if he might come aboard and show young Kenji our boat. Kenji was one of only 2 children on the island, from a population of 400 or so. He lived with his grandmother, a fortune teller at the temple on the hill. As Kenji grew older and moved upwards, the teacher told us, first the junior school would close, then the middle school. Throughout the beautiful islands of the inland sea, it was the same story. No more children are being born, and these islands are quieter than they've been for 1,000 years. Why is this so? Well, one reason is that women are these days educated at a similar level to men and in equal numbers, and yet in Japan's conservative society, they're expected to give up work and stay at home if they marry. Having seen the wider world, they prefer not to marry. We spent most of our sojourn in Japan in the inland sea, which is the historic and geographical heart of Japan. But what remained with us after 15 months was not so much an appreciation of the country's history, but a memory of ordinary people's kindness. A little story in closing that shows the very human heart of Japan. A final call before sailing east to Alaska was the fishing harbor of Shimoda at the entrance to Tokyo Bay. We've been scouring the internet daily for the latest typhoon warnings, usually taking advantage of the free Wi-Fi at McDonald's. Late on our last night in port, it must have been 2 a.m., there was a quiet knock on the hull and the whispered English word, police. I scrambled out in the dark, half-dressed. A young female police officer in uniform apologized, then tentatively handed me my wallet, which I must have accidentally left in the restaurant. I didn't need to check to know that nothing would have been taken. But I asked her, how did you find us? Oh, it's easy, she said. I look inside, I find visiting card from Ishi-san. I think he is your Japanese friend in Kobe. So I telephone him and wake him up. 1 o'clock now. You say, oh yes, Gaijin on Yoto. We all know only one Yoto in Shimoda, so here am I. So sorry to disturb you. She bowed politely and left. So unremarkable stuff for the Foreign Affairs circuit, perhaps, and that's a fair criticism. But for fear of ruining your dessert, I haven't included more sensational, if risque, encounters of this Gaijin with the Japanese position of communal public baths, for example, where nudity is de rigueur. For that, you'll have to buy the book. On a final practical note, if you're not lucky enough to win the fight for one of the 2 copies of Sailing to the Heart of Japan that Ian kindly brought on my behalf, I have to be honest and say it's not likely that Books on Beechwood will have it, but it is, as they say, available through all the usual outlets. Thanks for your patience, and until we meet again.
So I think these stories were so moving and so important that we've run a bit over time, but it was time well spent on our part. We had planned for a brief Q&A session. I didn't notice any questions online, but Gary Smith has a roving microphone. If anyone is inspired to make a brief comment or pose any questions, we'll try and take a couple before Roxanne makes a few announcements and officially wraps things up.
Mr. Edwards, and former ambassador to Japan. Well, I don't know who to ask the question to, but I was just reflecting on the last presenter and remarking about how many times I've heard the lost wallet story. It seems that this is a very common occurrence. When we were in Japan, my wife and I, there are many stories like this of the honesty of the Japanese people and so forth. So it's quite remarkable, and I'm so happy to have heard it again. Look, I have no question, but I do want to ask if this practice that you have in Ambcanada is as recognized as I think it should be for the way it assists not only people who have spent their lifetime, in some cases, in this career that we have called the Foreign Service, but in assisting and promoting these pursuits that so many of you have. I haven't written my book yet, and it won't get written, I don't think. Time has run out, or running out quickly. But it really is a remarkable thing that you do, and I think it's a tremendous thing you're doing, but a contribution to Canadian history, to Canadian literature, and so on. So rather than ask a question, Gary, you're the one that usually has all the questions. I'm more of the non-questioning kind, but I think it's something that this group, Ambcanada, should take a lot of credit for. It is truly a very unique and I think inspiring example. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Len.
Yeah, we have been doing a bit of outreach in terms of publicity, and Montreal Review of Books showed some interest in any books that were published by an author resident in Quebec. And Alex has been in touch with some of the media people. It didn't work this year, but we'll keep trying to spread the good word.
Bonjour, Paul Fauteux. I have a comment which is actually an expression of gratitude. I'd like to thank Bodil for the courage she showed in referring to the genocide in Gaza against the background of her own family history. I think that that is something that too many Canadians are looking away from. And I thank you very much for having had the courage to draw our attention to this very dark time in world history, especially for those of us who are attached to the rule of law and human rights and equality for all. Thank you so much.
That looks like it. Very strange for a group of colleagues here.
That's right. Ben, écoutez, on arrive à la fin de notre lunch et je voudrais remercier Ian Ferguson et Alex Bukaliskis et Doug. Vous n'avez pas idée du travail que Doug fait pour garder ça, toutes les choses en l'air. Et je veux aussi remercier le personnel et du club de golf ici. Alors, 3 événements qui s'en viennent. Le premier, c'est notre réception annuelle du 4 décembre à l'édifice Pearson, comme d'habitude. Parking, stationnement prévu pour tous et la présence de David Morrison confirmée. Alors, on vous attend 6 heures à 8 heures le 6 décembre, ou le 4 décembre, pardon. Et au mois de janvier, le 22 janvier, on attend la participation de Paul Wells, qui n'a pas besoin d'être présenté. Et je pense qu'on pourra aussi avoir la présence du président de l'association, Michael Small, pour cet événement. Et le 11 février, l'ancien ministre des Affaires étrangères, Marc Garneau, qui, comme vous savez, a aussi écrit un livre, devrait être avec nous pour partager sa biographie et ses pensées sur les moments actuels. Alors là-dessus, on vous remercie. C'est la principale chose à faire d'être venu aujourd'hui et à la prochaine. Merci.